to 5 p.m. and we will be live on MBS TV and online via Facebook, YouTube and Zoom. Supported by the United Nations Resident Coordinator's Office, National Planning Authority, UNDP, UNCDF, ACE Policy Research Institute and NBS Always.
Welcome back from that, and I totally agree that we need to build Ugandan solutions for Ugandan problems post-COVID-19, post-lockdown, or even for the near future. Our own problems will be solved by our own solutions coming from our own people. Coming up next to our next panelist is Dr. Jacklyn Makaaru Arinitwe, who is the director, S Policy Research Institute. And she's going to purposely focus on what the role of the state is in driving industrialization amidst an uncertain environment, looking at policy, regulation, investment, looking at financing, also including the non-state actors' perspective in that regard, but also how important it is, the role of research in the development discourse, because you cannot come up with any policy without having carried out a research. Like Mr. Tafwa told us, part of the research that UN has carried out is that unfortunately by 2021, 3.2 million people will be going back to poverty. Let's get to you, Dr. Jacklyn Makaaru. I will have about 7 minutes for your remarks. I hope that will be enough time for you.
We'll see about that, Mildred.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mildred.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, fellow Ugandans. I'm honored to speak to you today at this conference about the role of the state in driving industrialization towards what you have had as what we call the real economy now. So you might ask yourself, what is the real economy? And previous speakers have defined the real economy. Mr. Oshailab from Ministry of Finance defined the real economy as the economy that supports the basic needs of society. And academically and theoretically, we can define the real economy in a number of different ways. But for this conference, I draw the definition from a recent paper titled The Real Economy versus the Vulnerable Economy. This is a paper that was written by His Excellency the President and presented to Cabinet on April 15th, 2020. And he defines the real economy as an economy that indeed supports the basic needs of society: food, clothing, shelter, medicine, defense, infrastructure, education, health, and spirituality. And in this paper, what I take from it is that the president has laid very concrete ideas. Now we can take those ideas and concretize them to create a narrative for national transformation through industrialization. I know some people would like to ask, what is Uganda's industrialization strategy? But first, I'm going to remind you where we came from. We can all remember a time when Uganda had a booming industry sector delivered by state-owned corporations and parastatals. The state was in the driving state. But that was until the late 1980s, early 1990s, when Uganda was recovering from bad leadership and civil strife. And the Washington Consensus introduced what we call liberalization agenda. This is an approach that is dominant with a market approach as part of economic recovery. And in essence, this dominant approach was to say that we should loosen government ownership of some of these corporations because government was pursued as a bad business manager. So after the structural adjustment of the late 80s and 90s, the role of the state changed from being mainly involved in running the industries and other corporations to regulation, to policy making, and providing an enabling environment, mainly infrastructure, electricity, space for industrial parks. We know some of those. So, and the private sector took over. The economic liberalization was driven by privatization. Only a few industries in Uganda at the time could survive. Uganda Batteries is one of those countries. So what liberalization produced for us in Uganda was that privatization opened up our industries to global competition. Many collapsed. Some of you might remember Kilembe Copper Mines. Some of you might remember Chillington Hose, proudly made in Uganda, or the leather tanning, or UGIL, the Uganda garments. All those collapsed. So as privatization came in, what we call globalization took root. Globalization is this notion that the global economy is leveled. Everywhere is everyone's marketplace. So with privatization and globalization, the structure of our economy changed. Currently, our industries contribute only approximately 23% to our GDP. Agriculture contributes about 28%, and services, which contributes the biggest significant portion of our GDP at 50%, are dominated. The service sector is dominated by multinational corporations. Multinational corporations, for example, in the telecoms company or the banking industry, we can talk about MTN, we can talk about Airtel, we can talk about Standard Chartered Bank, we can talk about all these multinational corporations. What this means is that much as they contribute to our economy, most of the profits are repatriated and taken back to the countries where they are domesticated. That equals what we call capital flight out of our economy. Money leaves our economy. So what these multinational corporations have done, in addition to privatization and globalization, is that they have opened up our economy to rely on global value chains. The most recent and dominant example is China being the global factory of the world. But when China collapsed during the coronavirus, then the global economy collapsed as well. That's why we were not spared as Uganda when the coronavirus started ravaging the world. So the COVID crisis has taught us a few things about development. One, it has exposed the fault line in the global economic systems. We see that supply chains have been disrupted, they have been cut, and suddenly, because we rely on imports from other countries, we are not able to have the supplies, either medical or other industry supplies that we need to effectively curtail the disease or manage our domestic production lines. So our factories are not producing optimally, and you had a previous speaker who talked about the significant loss of jobs in our economy right now. Those are the demerits of reliance on global value chains. So COVID-19 as a crisis teaches us that we should be self-sustaining as a country first, and then we can trade with others using the surplus which we have produced. And therefore, this compels us to contain the unbridled spirit of capitalism. We must regulate our markets. We must make our markets responsive to the needs of the small and vulnerable producers. Further, we must rebalance the expenditure of government. In the recent past, government has mainly focused on infrastructure development, what in the speak of the National Planning Authority has been front-loading, building the fundamentals for takeoff, mainly on infrastructure. And this has happened, and it has been good. But now we need to move away from that to putting incomes and money in people's pockets. We need to rethink, strongly rethink, the model of transfer payments to vulnerable populations. For example, through the cash payments in livelihood programs, we have the Youth Livelihood Program, we have the Women Empowerment Program. In the past, there has been in Tandikwa and others. And now I hear there is one called the Myoga. So we can learn from these that they do not work. If you are a vulnerable population, you will not use this money for productive ventures. You use it for immediate consumption. So giving money to a vulnerable youth does not turn them into an entrepreneur. we can repurpose these funds into productive ventures of government. For example, I understand that the Uganda Development Corporation, to establish a medium-sized industry, requires about 20 billion shillings. So if we repurpose all these cash payments from these funds, small funds, we can establish about 20 medium-sized industries across the country. And this is likely to create jobs which are decent and which are more sustainable, and we will have addressed the question of vulnerability among the vulnerable population. So let's rethink and put more money into people's pockets. So with this crisis, and you have had us talking about reinventing the economy, redefining our priorities after COVID, what should the character of the state be? What should the role of the state be? For now, as I already mentioned, the state mainly does policy and regulation and providing the fundamentals. Yes, we can consolidate these current roles, and I'm going to give you how. I can give you how we can do this shortly. One, on regulation, we need more regulation of the markets, and in particular, the financial and banking sector, which are driven by profit, are risk-averse, and do not provide in any meaningful way the much-needed financial services to the sectors of growth and affordable credit to the private sector. What we can do now is, perhaps the Ministry of Finance can explain this, why we keep hearing about capitalizing UDB or Uganda Development Bank to a sufficient level, but that has not happened. Let's capitalize Uganda Development Bank to at least 10% of the total banking assets, so it can have an effect on interest rates, bring down the cost of borrowing money for the private sector. Additionally, we should have a nationally owned commercial bank that owns at least 10%, another 10% of the total banking assets. This will bring down the cost of borrowing for the regular entrepreneur, the regular business person, the regular investor and innovator. Okay, we must regulate Uganda Development Bank as a development bank. Currently, it's not regulated, so we need that. Again, on policy and regulation, let's protect our domestic industries against unnecessary competition and subsidy programs to agro-based industries. Countries like America protect their agricultural sectors. Why should we not protect our cotton? Why should we export as lint? Why should we not protect our coffee industry? Why should we export our maize to import cornflakes? Let's stop that and add value to our products. In reinventing the role of policy and regulation and laws, we need to strengthen Uganda National Bureau of Standards so that they can create a level ground for competition which breeds innovation. Currently, there is a lot of fake products on the market. Government will continue to enable the environment for investment, for industrialization. But more importantly here, let's improve coordination in industrialization. Currently, in our industrial parks, there's no backward and forward linkages. Let's allow creation of thematic linked industrial parks so that industries can feed off each other. The role of local government must evolve. Decentralization has not worked well, but it holds promise if we can reconfigure it. We must reconceptualize local governments to make them productive units with articulate local economic development plans so that we change this financing architecture of local governments depending on the center for their financing. And the remaining two of the roles of the state that must be redefined and we must be emphatic about is that the state should become a developmental state and take direct investment as a priority. The state should be able to own and shepherd critical enterprises that drive economic development. For example, in the oil industry, we shouldn't let outside companies build our pipelines, our refinery roads, our infrastructure, our railways, and other things, and then go away with all the technology. So let us partner with local firms through joint ventures, and we maintain the technology when this is when the work is already done. In this role of direct investment, we must strengthen UDC, the Uganda Development Corporation. This is the reason why it was created in 1952. We must capitalize UDC to stimulate aggressive and strategic industrial interventions. We must also require that UDC in the corporations where it is investing on behalf of government and on behalf of all of us, we must require independent management, strong performance management for these corporations, and we must move away from this impression that public resources do not require transparency and good management. Finally, the government should be, or the state should be more involved in research and development. We cannot industrialize if we don't know what products we need, if we don't know what varieties we need. We shouldn't have a beef processing plant and yet we don't have the right variety of beef to feed into that processing plant. We shouldn't have a potato plant in Kisoro that does not have the right breed of potatoes to go into it. So let's invest in research and development. And as I conclude, there are certain basics that must be in place for industrialization to take off. One, we must have the right inputs. It must be readily available. Let's avoid industrializing based on inputs that are going to come to other countries. Two, human capital development. That is education, that is skilling. We cannot build an industrial base with a population that cannot read and write. Industry requires highly skilled, specialized skill sets. We have the population, let us skill them. Let us link our youth to industrial development programs so that they can get something out of it that is more decent and sustainable. Technology. Yes, currently we don't have some of the technologies required to industrialize, but through joint partnerships with global technology leaders, we can enable technology transfer and digitization to our local companies and people. Last but not least, affordable and patient capital. We have to be able to enable the private sector thrive along the public sector. We need to reform and regulate the financial sector to fit the development agenda. Finally, fellow Ugandans, the essence of a national development plan is to enable our country's leadership and people to develop and adopt a shared mission and development objectives. The National Planning Authority, through the Vision 2040, NDP-1, National Development Plan 2, and now the third development plan have articulated these. But we can't continue with business as usual. A transformation development agenda must not be a list of interventions from government agencies. It should not be a government agenda. It must be a national agenda focused on values, mindset, and attitudinal changes that condition the environment to pursuing development for all without leaving anyone behind. We must be ambitious in our plan to transform Uganda economically and socially. I believe in the power of a developmental state. I believe in the wisdom of prioritization, and I strongly believe in the power of strong and transformational leadership. And together we can do this. I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacklyn Makaaru, but I know that my co-host, Mr. Ramadan Gobi, has a few questions for you.
Dr. Jacklyn, thank you for that elaborate presentation. At UDC, we have three key objectives, strategic objectives, and one of them, actually, you have spoken to it, of leveraging partnerships and networks to co-finance investments which can be in the areas of greenfield to ensure that we go into those areas where the private sector has not been comfortable going because of the too many risks and so on. Maybe also the the capital constraints. How best can you advise at this point in time of COVID for UDC to actualize this kind of partnership tomorrow, well knowing that we are at a time when the private sector itself needs help? How do we get that symbiotic relationship to work for us to have these investments work?
Your voice was not very clear, but what I get is you're asking how UDC can leverage the partnerships they have and work side by side with the private sector.
Yes.
So the core mandate of UDC is the investment arm of government. Yes, currently it is true that government borrowing at home crowds out private sector. That's one of the failures in the credit market and the financial markets, hence the need to regulate. But rather than to actualize industrialization, to actualize a transformational change, we need aggressive investments. And it is only UDC with the backing of the government and through partnerships that this can be actualized. The private sector has been here. We have talked about the economy relying on the private sector and private sector involvement and private sector production, but it has not transformed our economy. Yes, the private sector is doing okay in some aspects, but in other aspects, it's not. Look, what COVID has exposed is that the private sector is also dependent on value chains from elsewhere. So let us concentrate on products that we can sustainably and efficiently do where we have a comparative advantage. We need UDC to invest aggressively. We need the state to invest aggressively. We need the support of everyone on this. It will not only transform the lives of the ordinary person, but it will also transform the way the private sector does business, because the private sector also can partner with government through some of these initiatives that are costly for the private sector. I think that's what it will take to transform this economy. Again, transformation means that we must change the total structure of the economy. We can't rely on agriculture as it is now. We need to move more towards industry and make agriculture the base for our industries, because we have a comparative advantage there.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Jacklyn Makaaru, who is the Director of Policy Research.